All right, we get started. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of That's All Funny Today. My guest today is film and TV studies professor, lecturer, and author Leon Hunt. How you doing today,
I'm
Professor?
very well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
No, thank you for the time. I really do appreciate it. Just for me just being a regular dude. Um, I wanted to ask you some questions I written up. Uh, I had never seen any Mario Bava movies that I had known of prior to seeing, reading about you here on the Twitter or X, whatever you'd call it, and seeing that your book, Mario Bava, the Artisan as Italian Horror Auteur. Uh After watching Black Sunday and Blood and Black Lace, I could see how those movies inspired like horror culture here, notably like the violence and the I don't know, I this is my opinion, like the eroticism. Uh Considering a movie like in that same time here in America, like Psycho wouldn't even show a toilet flushing. That was controversial. Um in your opinion, what was the reason a director like Mario Bava and perhaps other foreign directors were able to push those limits with violence while America was like having trouble like showing it, or they were trying to hide violence or shoot around violence, in
I think
films?
Italian directors maybe had a harder time of it than it might seem. Um, and as the 60s go on, the violence probably does become more prominent. In some ways, it's surprising that Bava got away with as much as he
Mhm,
did, particularly in Black Sunday. I'm sort of thinking about what's happening at the same time. I mean, in the UK, we've got Hammer Films already by then. Hammer Films had started making horror films at the end of the 50s. They'd done Curse of Frankenstein and The Horror of Dracula. And Horror of Dracula was one of the reasons that Italian horror kind of took off in some ways because it was a hit with Italian audiences, and it sort of planted the idea that that maybe there's some interest in making horror films in Italy. Most of the early ones were vampire films, but yeah, I don't know if it's so much that Black Sunday is more violent, particularly than the Hammer films. I think it's a different type of violence.
mhm.
And you mentioned, there's a kind of an erotic dimension to it. Certainly, by the time you get to Blood and Black Lace, there is a kind of sadistic, erotic dimension to the film, which, even though it's not actually a gory film,
No.
there's not much in the way of blood, but there's something about the violence in that film that actually still seems quite startling now. And I think it's sort of the cruelty of it. There's something about it of people having their heads pushed into hot ovens and being throttled or having a kind of spiked glove shoved into their face, that that stuff's going to hurt. It's got that sort of very sort of tactile quality. That film, Blood and Black Lace, was cut to pieces in the UK. I think in the US it got through relatively unscathed. I think the distributors made some changes to it, but in the UK, I've seen the version that was originally released in the UK in 64, 65, and you cannot tell what's happening with any of the murders. The British censor, which was very, very strict over violence at that point. And you literally can't tell what's happened to most of the victims in that film. It's uncut now, all the sort of all the brutality is back in the film. Um, but yeah, I mean, Bava, as you probably know, had been a cinematographer. He'd started off as a cinematographer, and he'd been working for some time already. And he was an expert with special effects as well, because his father was a filmmaker as well. His father had made films in the silent era, and he had he knew all the tricks, really, all the kind of the visual trickery that you could do, how you could make, you could use sheets of glass to make it look like you've got a huge set. You could make it look as though you've got more extras than you'd really got. And Bava had started to make a name for himself working on other films that they would sometimes he was the cinematographer, and but they would need him to help out with other things. And also there were some films that ran into difficulties, whether the director walked off the film, or there were some Italian productions that had American directors working on them. And I think reading between the lines, I think the communication with the Italian crew sometimes ran into problems. So people like Bava, Sergio Leone actually was doing similar things around the same time of, the second unit director, but actually would take over parts of the film because the director was kind of struggling with the production. So he got a name for himself as someone who could step in. He knew all these tricks. He could do things quickly. And so they thought, well, why not let him direct a film? He knows how all of this stuff works. He's, in effect, he's actually directed a couple of films already. He's not been credited for it, but he has taken over films and directed parts of films. What led him to sort of push the violence in the way that he did, I don't know. I think that's Black Sunday, I think, is the first Italian. It's not the first Italian horror film, but I think it's the first Italian horror film that's got those things which we now associate with Italian horror. The spiked mask being hammered into Barbara Steele's face. You can sort of see a line from that, I think, to Dario Argento later on, and Lucio Fulci with some of the violence in their films.
Yeah, I think I saw an article saying that that was his direct, uh, response to Dracula being made or something? Do you think?
Yeah, Dracula had been a hit in Italy. It was released as Dracula Il Vampiro, and even though it was heavily cut in Italy, it wasn't. Italian censorship was not particularly liberal in the early '60s, particularly around sex. Still there was a very strong kind of Catholic grip on the public morals, and it would change as the '60s went on. Another of Bava's films ran into huge problems with the censor, a film called The Whip and the Body with Christopher
Mm.
Lee, which is about a sort of sadomasochistic relationship that actually manages to continue after one of the two people is killed, because he comes back as a kind of as a ghost with a whip, as it were, Christopher Lee, or does he? That's the interesting question in the film. That was actually seized by the authorities at one point. So
Oh.
he didn't always have an easy ride with these films.
And you had said, about the translation, issues, like, with the crew and the director. That's where why it leads to, like, the overdubbing, right? Because you had such a different cultural cast of crew.
Yeah, and you'd have actors from all over. I mean, that was true with the more sort of respectable Italian cinema as well. That's true of Fellini's films as well as Mario Bava's. But yeah, you'd have a mix of, because the money would be coming in often from different European countries. There'd be some, sometimes some French money, some German money. So they would want some French actors to be in the film, some German actors to be in the film. Most of Bava's films, if you look at the lip movements, you can see that they were shot in English,
Mhm.
um, but often featuring people who didn't speak English. So they would learn the lines. I mean, some of them they could manage to do the lines. They knew enough English to be able to do the lines. Others might just have to learn it phonetically. Apparently, on one film, one actor was having so much trouble with the English dialogue that Bava decided to sort of have a kind of circular tracking shot while he had a long speech to do. So the camera was not on him when he was doing his lines. So he could sort of, probably do his lines in Italian. And by the time the camera came back to him, he'd already sort of delivered his speech.
Oh, that sounds like a great director right there, knowing how to hide the, blemishes that could, lessen the film like that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, he was a problem solver. Because he was usually working with fairly low budgets, very, very tight schedules. This kind of international cast who would all be dubbed because they wouldn't shoot live sound. So they would dub them later. They'd often try and get a Hollywood star if they could, but it was usually a fairly faded Hollywood star. It was, someone who'd been a star, 10, 20 years earlier. So on Planet of the Vampires, for example, they've got Barry Sullivan, who had not really been a leading man for a while. Back in the 50s, he's in things like The Bad and the Beautiful, but you know, not such a big star by the time they got him.
No, I appreciate that information. That's interesting. In your book, Kung Fu Cult Masters, you discuss the world of Chinese martial arts and cinema. I was going to ask your opinion on a recent controversy. I don't know if you keep up with video games, but there's they're becoming more cinematic as far as being compared to film. And again, that's something I don't know how your opinion might be on that. But there's a game called Assassin's Creed Shadows, and I don't know if you've heard of it, but it takes place around Japan, 16th century, and the protagonist in this game where you play as the hero is an Asian female assassin, while the main villain is an African samurai. Do you think and there's a lot of controversy surrounding that because a lot of people were like, well, this isn't historically accurate, or video games should have be more historical and have Chinese representation or Japanese Chinese representation, of it correctly with the male protagonists because that's how it would have been back then. With this controversy in mind, should the story matter with historical accuracy, or should there be a balance between authenticity and entertainment? That's kind of where I'm going with it.
Yeah, I mean, I will. First of all, I will admit I am out of touch with video games now. When I was writing that book, I actually was playing video games, and
Oh
I actually
yeah.
wrote about video games a little bit in the book because I was an avid Tekken player back in the day, as it were. And I was a big fan of Tekken, and I was kind of interested in the interaction between, the kinds of that in these games you would see moves that were recognizable from particular martial arts stars. You would think, okay, that's Bruce Lee, that's Jackie Chan, he's a little bit like Jet Li, and so on and so forth. Um, so I don't want to tread on the toes of games experts. And I say I don't. I've heard of this game, but I don't particularly know it. I don't know if. I mean, I suppose my assumption tends to be that games. If that were a film, what you've just described to me would I think would be more of a problem.
Uh-huh.
That there is you expect not complete historical accuracy, because certainly Chinese martial arts films have always played fast and loose with historical accuracy. It's like if it looks accurate enough, that's usually kind of okay. I think that sort of traditional Japanese swordplay films have sort of been a bit more careful about getting their historical period right. um, so I think I'm aware. I'm talking about a game I don't know. I mean, it's certainly it's an interesting debate to be had. There's probably arguments. I'm sounding very both sides here, and I might have a stronger opinion if I knew the game. But yeah, I think maybe games have a bit more of a license. And also, I don't know, is it a Japanese produced game?
It's made by yeah, I believe the company is in Japan, but it's made by like a they always pride themselves on like multicultural because they've had different time periods. This is probably like the 10th game plus of different stories they've had of assassins in different countries. So this is the first time that it's taking place in Japan, and people are kind of, like I said, up in arms. And you know how the internet is, they kind of run with a controversy sometimes, maybe blow it out of make a mountain out of a molehill. But I was just curious if that ever happened, like in a film where people were more upset of, well, that's not historically accurate, but it's entertaining, or vice versa, you know?
Yeah, I mean, certainly with Chinese martial arts cinema, I think the idea that it's not historically accurate, but it's entertaining, has been allowed to run quite a long way. Because I can think of, really very few Chinese martial arts films that go all out for historical accuracy. Maybe there are a few. I mean, usually as soon as you get into the fight scenes, the fight scenes immediately take us into a much more fantastical, performative style of fighting than the way anyone has ever fought in a real fight, historically ever.
Mhm.
It's an entertaining genre first and foremost. It will allude to real historical events and real historical conflicts. So, Chinese martial arts cinema, it will usually tell you which period it's set in, and that period will have certain kinds of cultural aspects attached to it. If it's set during the Qing dynasty, for example, then it's probably going to be about Han Chinese being in conflict with the Manchurians who are ruling them. If it's set in the period leading up to the Sino-Japanese War, then the Japanese are going to be the bad guys. Those kinds of details will come into it. Um, but I'm sort of thinking of a film like Ip Man with Donnie Yen, that alludes to real historical events that happened um, during the sort of Sino-Japanese War and Japan's occupation of parts of China. But then it proceeds to tell a story about one person being able to fight lots and lots of Japanese and never getting shot or facing, the consequences that a real martial artist would probably have faced if he tried to take them on in that way. So, often real historical events are a sort of a jumping off point for a rather more fanciful story.
Oh, no, thank you. I'm moving on to British comedy and American comedy. I figured I know you've done, I think, a book about British comedy, right? Or something of the sort. My first introduction to British comedy, and I don't know if you could consider this, because when I was younger, around reading James and the Giant Peach, or Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I feel like that's British comedy humor by Roald Dahl. The books, even the movies, especially. Um, and then graduating when I became an adult to Roald Dahl having adult short stories that I know about,
Mm.
like Tales of the
Tales of
Unexpected,
the Unexpected, yeah.
which are very like Twilight Zone, but in a funny way, almost twist. Um, what do you believe makes British comedy different from American, at least back then? And was there like a point where now they're almost one and the same? Because I know in the past, British comedy was more like dark humor, and now I don't know, we've kind of reached that here in America where we're really pushing the edge on humor and stuff like that. Or is there still a difference?
Um, it's always really difficult to answer that because there are different kinds of British comedy. Um, and I think both American and British humour have some similarities. That there's a type of British humour that I think goes back to musical, that is kind of, broader physical humour. I think there's an American equivalent of that with vaudeville and burlesque. I think there are some similarities between both of those. People often talk about, I mean, one of the differences that people sometimes talk about is how, in, for example, British situation comedies, that they're often about failure. They're often about people who are failures in some way, and they're delusional. That there's a kind of self-deprecating quality
Mm,
in British comedy that I think you do find in American comedy as well, but maybe you find it a bit more recently. That maybe sometimes the sort of the protagonists in American sitcoms were sort of, they were kind of cooler somehow. They weren't losers in quite the same way that the characters in British sitcoms were. But then I think of something like Frasier, and Frasier seems to me to have a lot of the qualities that I do associate um, with with British comedy. That, it relies on verbal wit. It has characters who don't always have that much insight into themselves, and therefore, they're slightly delusional about themselves. Um, so yeah, there are probably as many similarities as there are differences. And after all, in the UK, we've been watching American comedy, pretty much from birth onwards. So you get a kind of pretty good mix of the two. I grew up watching American sitcoms as well as British ones.
okay, cool. Staying on topic of, other countries creating versions of other shows, whether it's like the British Office, The Office. Now there are these American The Office, or South Korea having like The Good Doctor, and then here in America we have The Good Doctor now. Uh, they become either successful or just more successful or just as successful as their original shows. Do you believe that, like, that success would happen, I don't know, like, just in the past now when there wasn't a lot of the internet, or now that we have sort of streaming to where we could watch the original shows, it would actually make those original shows not really want to have remakes that are culturally uh pertaining to like a different culture, or make them want even more, what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah, I mean, I think now it's much easier to see both versions, obviously. Whereas in the past, I mean, I think one of the earliest ones I know of a British sitcom becoming an American sitcom was, there was a British sitcom called Till Death Us Do Part, where basically the central character is a racist, and the audience is sort of invited to laugh at his ignorance. And that became All in the Family.
mm,
So the character of Alf Garnett became Archie Bunker, I think,
mm.
is the character's name. But I don't think I've ever seen All in the Family. I just knew it existed. I don't think it was ever shown in the UK. We had a sitcom called Man About the House, which became, what was it? What did it become? Three's a Crowd, I think it became,
Three's
in
Company.
the Three's Company. Yeah,
Mm.
probably. It's a guy sharing a flat with two girls. Yeah,
pretending
that's
he
the one.
pretending he's kind of gay in order
Yeah, that's how
to,
he
yeah.
gets in the first episode. Yeah, yeah. In the past, we knew those sitcoms, the American versions existed, but we didn't. I don't think they were shown in the UK. I never saw them. Whereas now, obviously, yes, with streaming, you can watch whichever version of The Office you prefer. And the American one has sort of lasted longer than the British one did. Or In the Loop becomes Veep, but has actually got the same writers pretty much working on it. So certainly there have been some very successful translations. Um, Maybe that pushes them to do a better job with them because they know that the audience of the original are likely to watch them as well. Um, I know there is an American version of Ghosts, which I haven't seen. Ghosts, the British sitcom. I haven't seen the American version of that. I've seen people say positive things about it. Um, it's always, I mean, some comic ideas. Obviously, the core of them, the core of the idea translates well.
Hmm.
You know, wherever you live in the world, you know what it's like to work in an office, and you might encounter different kinds of people in that office, but there's some equivalent of that somewhere that you can get jokes out of. Um, so I think some of those ideas, and I say I've never seen All in the Family, but I know it's a well remembered sitcom, so that obviously worked worked for an American audience. What a British audience would have thought of it, we'll never know. But yeah, they obviously have found ways of doing it with things like The Office.
Uh-huh. No, yeah, and I just thought that strange that because I think the British Office, the version, I think it ran for what, 1 or 2 seasons, whereas
Yeah, I think
the
it was 2 seasons and some specials, I think, or yeah,
and the American was like what, 7, 8, 9
yeah,
seasons, and I just
yeah.
wonder like that, your opinion on that, like why
I think
it became so
also
popular.
there traditionally there is a difference in the writing of sitcoms. The
Mhm.
tradition in British television is there is a person or people, because often it was a pair of people, and they write the whole sitcom. And that's why probably they run out of steam a bit sooner. After a couple of series, they've run out of ideas. Whereas I know there's a tradition in the American sitcom, you have a pool of writers.
Mm,
um, that makes it easier to keep it going for longer. You've got more people pitching in with jokes. There's more mileage. They're not going to get tired. They're not going to run out of ideas and get exhausted quite so quickly. And that's why British comedy series tend to just run 2 or 3 series. Faulty Towers is another sort of very fondly remembered British sitcom. That was 2 series, and that seemed to. I think Faulty Towers is actually one of the reasons why the British office just ran for two series, because it seemed to plant that idea that if you want to maintain quality, you don't go on too long. But you
yeah.
can't separate that from the fact that you've only got 1 or 2 writers working on it. Whereas if you got more, you might be able to keep going a bit longer.
Yeah, so it's sorta not overstaying your welcome and
Yes.
quality over
Yeah,
quantity.
nobody wants to, be seen to jump the shark and, oh, if only they'd stopped with the last series. I think that's what every comedy writer fears.
Uh-huh. No, that actually I get that now. That definitely makes sense. From your perspective on film and television, do you think real life news is becoming more cinematic? Like watching the news, and I don't know if you on YouTube will see streamers or kids are watching streamers, or people. Do we think it's becoming more like cinematic where we want to live through these lives vicariously, almost like a surrogate, like a Truman Show of other people's lives? Do you think real life's becoming more viewing wise cinematic or
Yeah, I mean, I
news?
suppose there are more and more things that people can watch. I mean, one thing I've become quite intrigued by on YouTube are these kind of fake trailers for films that don't exist, and people sort of imagine, what would a Batgirl film with the actress from Wednesday look like, and you sort of a couple of minutes in and thinking, this film doesn't exist. This is something that's been entirely made up. And also people making trailers for what a Batman movie would be like if it had been made in the 1950s, or
Mm,
what Blade Runner might have looked like if it had been made in the 1950s. There are all those kinds of intriguing things going on, and I suppose TikTok and people filming their own lives and creating their little vignettes. Um, I think I don't know whether that's becoming more like movies, or movies are becoming more like that. I'm not sure which way around it is.
no, definitely. I didn't think about that way. Yeah, movies are kind of mirroring that uh quick little, you know, 10-second, oh, we need action and then let's move on, you know.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned like these fake trailers or parodies or whatever you'd want to call them. Do you believe the AI, artificial intelligence, because some of these are, made by that or at least assisted in making it. Do you think it's helping filmmaking or hurting filmmaking, or ultimately it'll be, or we just have to embrace it? I mean, it might just be the future.
It's not something I want to see a huge amount of in feature films. I think the way it's being used on YouTube is, I think it's creative, and also it's upfront about what it's doing.
Hmm.
That if you're watching, a fake trailer for, Batman as if it had been made in 1950s Technicolor, you know what you're watching. That's not something you can do without AI, really. And maybe there are a few things that you can't do without AI. I don't know. I think the problem becomes, and this is a lot of people's objection to it, is where it's used as a shortcut to replace, genuine creative labor from people.
Hmm.
Where even, there's talk of trying to generate scripts through AI. I can't see that ending anywhere good. Um, uh, 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 there probably is a place for it somewhere where it might create something. Maybe that's the test of it, something that you can't create by any other means. But if it just becomes a shortcut, or it becomes a way of just not having to pay people to do it, or cut down on the people working on a film, um, that it's hard to see the positives in that, really.
No, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, I could see them. It would be better, like you said, to, or not even better, but to know, to categorize it like, hey, YouTube, it's cool, these what ifs and little, parodies or whatever with the AI, but yeah, definitely taking over jobs or the creative control. It's not a good thing. Finally, and again, thank you for your time. What do you prefer, zombies or vampires?
Oh, um, now that is a tricky one, because I have, if we're talking purely about contemporary cinema, I would say zombies all the time, because I'm very old school about vampires. I like the vampires in cinema, really, from the sort of the universal sort of Bela Lugosi vampires through to the sort of Hammer Christopher Lee vampires. And I do so. I probably I like those vampires,
Hmm.
um, and which is not to say I don't like contemporary vampire films, but somehow I attach, as an aging horror fan, I have a great affection for, the capes and the fangs, and vampires who are, supernatural beings, and they're, you know glamorous but fundamentally bad. Um, so I do have a great sort of fondness for them, but in the current landscape, probably find zombies a bit more fun
Oh,
in
yeah.
contemporary movies.
Well, no, thank you for your time, sir, professor. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me on. It's fun to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, no, and, yeah, I have your information down there on the Twitter if people can find you, or X, I keep forgetting, and they can
It'll
check
always
out.
be Twitter to me.
Yeah, they can check you out there. Uh, and I wanna thank you again for your time. Appreciate it, and yeah, thank everyone for listening, and bye, everyone. Thanks.